What up, cuh? Hey guys, it's been a while. I've been super busy, and I think it's a perfect time to talk about A Complete Unknown, which I actually saw yesterday at an early screening. And this is one that I'm actually really excited to talk about because I'm kind of a big Bob Dylan fan. Not like to a point where I know every single era of Bob Dylan, but I know a little bit about Bob Dylan as a musician and a songwriter. So let me just kind of bring in my history of Bob Dylan into this video form. And then I will also talk about the movie A Complete Unknown in a way where I can kind of like deconstruct the emotions of the film. So let me start by saying that I saw this film yesterday at an early access screening. Usually I do that. And even before, knowing what this movie was about, I was just excited to see a biopic about Bob Dylan, especially in this specific time of Bob Dylan's life where he went from the typical folk genre stuff to the going electric stuff, which is probably one of the most biggest shifts in music history. So knowing that they were going to make a movie about this, I jumped on it and I was just like, hell yeah, let's do this. And on top of that, Timothée Chalamet playing Bob Dylan is a really interesting thing because right now Timothy is at a point in his career where he's kind of like mirroring Leonardo DiCaprio and his like prestige era, jumping from like Titanic to like Martin Scorsese movies and then going like back and forth between like big movies and like smaller movies and then getting like Oscar nominations here and there, and then eventually becoming one of like the best like actors living today. And let me just start by saying that Timothée Chalamet is kind of like at that point in his career where he's starting to like pick these like bigger roles, but like also going back to like the normal like adult drama stuff that usually we don't really see a lot in this like current landscape, but he's one of the youngest actors working today who is able to carry that weight and do like these two like polar opposite things, doing like big movies and smaller movies. And yeah, like I was excited alone to see Timothy try out this new kind of perspective area that I've never seen from like Timothy before, even though last year he did Wonka, which was a musical, and from there you can see like, oh, he can actually sing. But I don't know if he can like actually emulate the essence of Bob Dylan, especially since this is an era where he starts to really like understand like how, ego full he is and how like swaggy he is, or swag. I think that's like the right word to describe Bob Dylan. He was just swag. Like he was like in a moment where he was just doing like swag shit. So, you sent that. And then you also have James Mangold, who's coming off of Indiana Jones 5, which was not good, but it was like studio driven. And you can tell like he wasn't like really into like making the movie. He just wanted to like get a quick bag and dip out. So you have that all in mind. And even before like James Mangold, he directed Walk the Line longs ago, but that was like one of those movies where it went deep into like Johnny Cash's life, but it was more of like going through like these like specific points in his life compared to like this movie where you're seeing just like one specific part of Bob Dylan's life. And it makes sense because Walk the Line is kind of like the connective tissue to this movie, A Complete Unknown. It's kind of like a sister album to Walk the Line, especially since Johnny Cash reappears here but played with a different actor. Joaquin's not in it. Instead it's Boyd. I forgot the last name, but yeah, like he plays Johnny Cash. So you set that all in mind, and then you go into the movie, and the movie starts out with Dylan landing on in New York City, trying to understand himself, trying to like understand the city, while also hanging out with these like big folk heroes like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. And these two like really like powerful like folk heroes that like Dylan looked up to around that time. He just like shows up in New York City, and then he just starts hanging out with these people, and he starts like talking to like the different musicians that are like working in this like frame space. And the entire movie is just basically the process of making music. Some parts of the movie you'll see like Dylan hanging out with like a bunch of women, and he's having like a threesome situation, a love triangle between Sylvie and the other actress, which I forgot the actress's name and the character name, but I will flash it on the screen. So these two things are happening. Like, he's trying to like figure out where his music direction's going, while also trying to figure out this relationship between these two women. And that like opens like a space between trying to figure out who Bob Dylan is. And you don't get that like in the movie, because Bob Dylan is a musician who had multiple personalities and like personas, to the point where you can't really pinpoint who exactly he is. He's just an enigma. He's just a mysterious person. Some people who recount like his stories around this time, they say like, oh, he was just like kind of like this cool like musician who just did not give a fuck about like people around him. And yeah, but you'll also have other people telling his story like, oh, like he was a different person in this era. He was mean, or he was kind of cool. Like a lot of the stuff is just like circling all around, and you don't really get to pinpoint who exactly Bob Dylan is. And that's entirely the point of the movie, and entirely the point of Bob Dylan. He's just a mysterious person and an artist who just cared about the music process, the songwriting, getting his like artistry out into the open, and that was that. And yeah, like this movie really delivered the goods with that in mind, that thematic in mind. And let me start by saying that Timothée Chalamet, his performance in this is just fantastic. Like, I had no problems with how he portrayed Dylan in this movie, especially with like the accent and the stuff that he does with like the guitar playing and like the harmonica playing and like the kazoo playing, especially with the title track Highway 61 Revisited. If you've listened to the song before, it opens with a kazoo kind of like solo thing for like 30 seconds, and then he just like jumps into like the first verse. You see that process of like Bob Dylan finding the kazoo outside of the streets near like the clubs he used to like hang out, or still hangs out, and then he gets the kazoo, he tries it out in the bathtub, and then eventually he lands in the studio and he just uses it randomly during a recording session, and then it just works. It's just magic. And that's basically like Bob Dylan's like mantra and like motive. He just does stuff out of like magic, and it's unexplainable. You don't understand like his entire like songwriting process, but like he's just a guy who just goes into the studio, fucks shits up, and then just like dips out. Like, that's basically it. But like Timothy, like his performance like was really good. Although I do think like in the first 30 minutes, if you know like Bob Dylan, like how he like talks, it starts out like him having like the, the thick like, yeah, little accent, like, yeah, I'm gonna go to the store and all that. And like, it's jarring to like hear it coming out of like Timothée Chalamet, but then eventually you start to warm up to it, and then like the first songs where he's like singing like the freewheeling Bob Dylan era of songs, which was just like down-tempo folk songs, chilled out like folk songs. He's doing it, and he's just like, oh shit, like you're watching it, and he's nearly perfecting like a lot of like the vocal cadence of Bob Dylan's and like his inflections. And then eventually when it transitions to the Highway 61 tracks, you're just like, oh shit, like he's doing like a Rolling Stone, he's doing like the title track, and he's like doing it like word for word, bar for bar, like just spitting hot fire. Like he's Dylan in the flesh.
Boom, bam, bop, bada bop, boom, pow.
And yeah, like I really fucked with it. I really fucked with his performance, and yeah, I can say like it's top 5 best performance of the year, and he does deserve like the Oscar nomination, in my humble opinion. I know a lot of people are just like, oh, like Timothée Chalamet hasn't like shown his range yet. I mean, that's like more of like the general audience perspective, like people who haven't seen, Call Me by Your Name or Bones and All, or any other movie that you haven't seen beside, Dune. But you watch this and you're just like, okay, I understand like Timothée Chalamet's like work process. I understand like what he's trying to do here. I don't know if it was method or not, but like he really paid attention to like the emotions and like the feelings of Bob Dylan and the stuff he does musically and just ego wise, especially ego wise. Like this dude was just full of ego and did not give a fuck about anybody around him. I will say also the side characters in this movie, I'm like looking at my notes. Woody, played by Scoot McNairy, he shows up in the beginning and like he's sprinkled throughout the movie. He's one of the folk musicians who suffers from a medical disease. He can't talk anymore. He stutters a lot and he's very like comatose. He opens the film and ends the film. It's not really a spoiler, but he's basically the connective tissue of the movie. And he pretty much elevates Dylan's journey into this new territory, which is New York City. And then you have Sylvie, played by Ellie Fanning, who just appears and becomes Dylan's girlfriend. And they have kind of like a troubled relationship, especially when another character, another woman shows up into the forefront. And that relationship also is kind of like troubled because Dylan's a player and he's kind of like fucking a lot of women because he's cool like that. But then, you know, you have the two things clashing, and then you also have the emotions of Dylan trying to like commit to this electric, I should say, music, from him going from like folk to electric, and Pete Seeger, played by Edward Norton, kind of going like in and out of like the picture and being like, oh, you can't like do that electric stuff. People are going to be pissed off about it. You have to like stay to your roots, and you should continue like staying to like this folk genre. Like you shouldn't be like deviating away from it. And of course Dylan's just like, nah, fuck you, I don't care, like I just want to like hang out with all my friends, and I also want to be the type of musician that I always wanted to be. And yeah, it's a whole thing. And eventually when you get to that very troubled section in the film where he's doing the performance at the Newport Festival in 1965, where he immediately like picks up the electric guitar and he starts playing like the riff of like a Rolling Stone and the other tracks from Highway 61, and then people are just like throwing bottles at him and like booing at him, and the sound people like on the backstage are like fighting and just like ready to like rumble with the emotions of Dylan picking up that guitar, that electric guitar. And then eventually the film kind of ends in a way where everybody's just like, oh shit, like he did something like fucking crazy and now he's gonna like face the consequences of his actions. But really it's just like, nah, he literally just like did his thing and people were mad about it. But like also at the same time, you look past it and you see like, oh shit, like that changed music forever, bro. Like that shit like really put me into my soul. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy like musical biopics, because especially the ones that like actually just focus on like one specific like area of like a musician's life. I don't like these like biopics where they just do like the, oh, here's the rise and fall and like that's that. I'm more attuned to the idea of like showing a musicians, sorry, my pronunciation, I'm going fucking crazy, but no, like the idea of like a musician going through like this one specific like part of his life and him or her going through it and then eventually like overcoming it. I think that's like a better way of like doing like these musical biopics compared to like doing like the rise and fall. But yeah, I think James Mangold really paid attention to Bob Dylan's own history around this time, and I thought the direction was really solid. There's also like a really incredible scene with Dylan and Pete at like this local television educational program thing where he's hanging out with like this other blues musician who's black, and they just like trade like camaraderie together, and it's like a whole like scene of like musical beauty. And I literally was like laughing and like really like enjoying like the emotions of like that scene. And I think that's like the best scene in the film, where you see like Timothy just like being like in tune with like all these like people around him, especially the musician and Edward Norton, and it's a beautiful scene. And man, like this was just a blast. I really enjoyed it. I think the only problem that I do have is that the love triangle in this movie is kind of like not half-assed, but there's a moment in the film where it starts to kind of like falter, and you kind of like expect where that like relationship between Sylvie and the other woman in this film, how it's going to end, and where it ends is just like, okay, well, yeah, that's how it is. But at the same time, like I think the women in this movie are kind of like written thinly. Their performances are good, but they're just kind of like written thinly. But other than that, I really enjoyed this. And again, I think the other problem that I do have with this movie is just like the runtime. There's like long stretches where you just see Bob Dylan just like walking around New York City, pondering, contemplating about like his music and just his whole process. And it's kind of like, okay, where are we going here? And then immediately it jumps to the first time he does the Newport festival, where he's just doing like the typical like folk guitar stuff, and he's hanging out with the other woman in this movie, and they eventually like hang out and they have like the duets and all that. But then eventually it shifts forward to the 65 performance with the electric guitar. But yeah, like I really enjoyed this. I would give it a 4 out of 5, and I would definitely like watch this again, especially since I'm really into music as a whole and just Bob Dylan in general. I think it's one of the better like musical biopics out this year, and just in general. I kind of like relate the next to Elvis, which played a lot with more of just the showmanship of a musician, even though that movie was just like, oh, this is like a rise and fall thing, but like it also had like a lot of like artistic flair. There was a lot of like editing and like shit like flying around. But yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I would like to see like a movie where you see Bob Dylan going through like the religious era of his like music life, where he was like, you know what, fuck it, like I want to like make secular music and make like gospel and that like type of music. And then there was also a period where he did like reggae rock with Infidels, and then even before that, I think Luca Guadagnino was supposed to direct a film about the Blood on the Tracks era, where he was having like a relationship problem with someone. I think it was his wife, and that like led to him making Blood on the Tracks, the album, which has Tangled Up in Blue, which is one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs like ever. Like it's fucking fantastic. And like Idiot Wind also is like one of my favorite Dylan songs. Or even then, like you can go like even further into like the 90s stuff, where he was like coming back, and eventually I think he won a Grammy for album of the year for, I think it was like Modern Times, which was an album where he was doing like the rockabilly stuff. You can like even go even further to like today, where he's just a mysterious performer. He just like does a performance here and there. He even like nowadays, like his last album, he was like doing like this weird kind of like rapping thing with I forgot which album, Rough and Rowdy.
But you know, and the Godfather Brando, mix it up in a tank and get a robot commando.
Yeah, that album, the last album he dropped. Sorry, like my brain's going all over the place, but like that album alone has a lot of like heaters. He was just like one of these musicians who just like understood like lyrics and like just not repetition, but he was like the original rapper. Like he spit it like a lot of fucking bars and just like heaters, and he was like political, and he's one of the last musicians to like really like stay true to himself. And I fuck with like that shit. But yeah, 4 out of 5. Great movie. Go see it in like the biggest fucking screen, IMAX, Dolby. Like, yeah, you won't be disappointed. And you won't be disappointed with like Timothée Chalamet's performance. Yeah, that's basically it. Peace out. I will be continuing my lists of movies this year. Worst of coming up pretty soon. That's going to take some time. And then, you know, best of 2024. So stick around for that. And I love you guys. Peace.